From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis for another week, and we're glad to have you with us. And thanks for watching. You know, there's a high school in Chicago that was built for 2,112 students, and its current enrollment, 277. And it's not alone. There are at least 17 Chicago high schools that are on the same bubble, and our city faces some incredibly tough questions about what to do with these giant buildings. As parents are given choices, they're opting for smaller, theoretically safer high schools with better academic records. But there are giants like Lane that are still thriving on massive campuses. It's all part of a really complex soup of issues. Falling overall enrollment, vastly increased options, a different way of budgeting that's left the big old high schools out in the cold. And if you want a stunningly revealing treatment of this phenomenon, you've simply got to go to the Tribune and read their series, Shrinking Schools. We'll be talking about that today. Can these Chicago high schools survive? Jennifer Smith Richards and Juan Perez Jr. did it. And Juan is back at the table again with us today. Glad to have you. So glad to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
And let me just say straight up on top, congratulations on just a beautiful piece of journalism. We love to talk about good journalism here on this show, and it's just another one of them. And it is available at the Tribune website, and it's worth a read because we are not going to be able to do much justice to us here in about a half an hour. But want to talk about all of that. But you're the education guy, and the big education story right now, of course, is the change at the top. Forrest Claypool gone and Janice Jackson coming in. Because we're a little bit jealous of our time, I guess maybe we don't really need to talk that much about Forrest Claypool. He screwed up and he lost his job. But Janice Jackson I'll give you my impression first.
Sure.
I've always found her to be a really sort of dedicated public servant and really interested in the academic issues. She's risen up through the system, and she might be an excellent leader. She seems to have great public stance. She seems to be able to hold a room rather well. But she's an academician, and the idea has always been that you have two people at the top, one who handles all the brute force finance and management and one who handles the education. Is it a good move for her to move into? I guess she's going to do both now or whatever. What's happening?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, down to brass tacks as far as what's going to happen internally, what kind of team is she going to assemble? How is that team going to handle a lot of stark financial questions that the district has been facing and will continue facing, especially with its escalating pension payments and the debt that it continues to take on to stay afloat. Who's going to handle that sort of thing? That was Forrest Claypool's main bailiwick here, and he assembled a lot of consultants and a lot of insiders and a lot of longtime allies to help kind of guide the ship through the worst things that you saw happening in the past 2 fiscal years. But now, we're in this kind of nebulous area where I'm really curious to see what happens. Who is actually going to be coming on board to handle the sort of more technical operations? Right. From a policy perspective, though, I think there may be a lot of people out there who might be optimistic that some sort of massive sea change might be coming as far as what kind of policies the district is going to be pursuing. I might tend to caution against that. I don't know how big of changes we're going to be seeing as far as that sort of thing, as far as that sort of thing is concerned, especially when it comes to school choice policies, for example, which I think we're going to talk a lot about more later in the program. But she's going to have some big challenges confronting her immediately. But you're right, she's held within extremely high regard inside of the mayor's office. She has a lot of good. What's the word I'm looking for? She's on good paper with a lot of people. Yeah. The Chicago Teachers Union, you heard, greeted her appointment with a degree of optimism, which is notable. Right. Which is notable. But at the same time, you heard Vice President Jesse Sharkey saying that the question is going to be about policy. Is she going to continue to go down this road that the district has been going down, or is she going to do more to work against that and listen more, I think is how the CTU described it. We'll have to see.
You can look at these things at the granular level or at the slightly larger level, and when it comes to the individual debates about the teacher training academy and the merging of certain schools, it's very controversial within those schools and those parents and everything else.
Right.
But my overall impression has been that she's been very willing to work with communities and try to hash out compromises and workable solutions, because there are no easy solutions to these things. As George Bush once said, if it was easy, it would have been done already, right? So I feel optimistic about it, but I still don't understand who's going to deal with the state and the money and all the rest of that. So I guess
what's amazing to me about all of this is that the circumstances that led to Claypool's resignation from the district, that whole series of circumstances, all of this could have been avoided, right? There were questions about whether, his general counsel, who was also a political donor and a longtime ally, should have been supervising this legal contract from his old firm as they pursued this lawsuit against the state of Illinois. There were some ethics questions there, but I suppose they could have easily been aired in public.
Yeah.
It could have easily, been taken care of with a couple of news cycles and a little bit of navel gazing by those of us in the press corps.
I completely agree with that. It could have been so easily handled, and I just don't want to get into a lot of this because I don't want to waste a lot of time on it. I have a personal history with Forrest Claypool. I worked with him when I worked at the city of Chicago, and I also was once his press secretary. So I got to know him fairly well, and I believe him to be a man of integrity. But the most amazing thing to me is that I always thought of him as being a really good press secretary. He was really good at handling the media. And this was a case of not handling the media very well at all. And I'm just kind of shocked that it all happened. And I would say one other thing, which might reveal my bias, I guess, but I thought that the idea of that particular lawsuit was in its and the value of it was a good idea. Let's sue the state of Illinois and call the state of Illinois a bunch of racists and see if we can get more money out of them that way. I mean, look, it's a war, right? The sides are at war with each other. They want to give you less money. You want to get more money from them. So you have to fight a kind of a tough fight. And
now here we are.
Right. It was in the pursuit of that all this other stuff got screwed up. Anyway, let's talk about these high schools.
Sure.
You identified 17, but that's just where you arbitrarily drew your cutoff. I mean, there are lots of high schools that are under-enrolled now, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it arbitrary as far as where we kind of set the cutoff. For starters, the high schools that we examined, we decided to limit our examination straight up to neighborhood high schools, right? Those that have assigned boundaries that are open to anybody who lives within them, and frankly anybody else from anywhere else in the city. But if you live inside the borders, you're guaranteed a seat if you're eligible to walk in the door and sit down for classes. That allowed us to just get a sense right away of, okay, how, this has been a perennial question with us. How well are they attracting students who live within their neighborhood boundaries? How many of the students who live within their neighborhood boundaries are leaving? Those are two questions. And then the big one that we always wanted to answer was, well, when they leave, where do they go? Where do they go?
Yeah, exactly.
And so we started with neighborhood high schools.
Can I just pause for one
Yes.
second? Just to clarify, and I think this is a really important clarification, that when you're talking about the neighborhood high schools, they are different from other high schools in that their primary purpose is to serve, or at least theoretically, to serve that neighborhood, right?
Correct.
That's their number one job. They also, because the rules were changed a while ago, they can also accept kids from anywhere in the city, but that's not their main job, as opposed to like I don't know what, Whitney Young or something.
I think we've talked about this before, almost a spiritual embodiment that the idea of the traditional neighborhood high school also holds, as well as it's like your church, it's like your bank, it's like the grocery store. It's an anchor of the neighborhood. At least that's how it was traditionally conceived, right? It's part of the social fabric and glue that brings it together. And yet, in the case of these 17 buildings, we found that concept has been completely turned around on its head, because at least in the case of these 17 buildings, you have students leaving for dozens, as few as 90 and as many as more than 100 different high schools within the city, almost 150 different high schools throughout the city.
It's incredible.
That's where these students are spreading to. Those numbers were astonishing to us. I mean, just the just how widespread it is and how far the geographic spread of these
people must be
children's
spending
choices
hours to get there and back.
You know, that is an interesting data set that we did start taking a look at. I think it would, you know, there's a bell curve, right, and there's a great middle where these things tend to average out. You know, the tail of the 3-hour commute does exist. I don't think it's as frequent as I don't think it occurs as frequently as people might think it does. But we did spend a lot of time with one family, for example, who leaves their home near Gage Park High School and spends an hour aboard 2 CTA buses, you know, going east and then north, and just watching the demographics of the city change as different groups of students board and disembark during that trip, going to different high schools, while they make their way all the way to Westtown and to Wells High, and they're going to Wells High School.
And it doesn't make a lot of sense because Wells, at least academically, is only marginally better than their school.
Honestly, it falls within, it's another one of the 17 schools that we examined, you know. So this is an instance, and it's not very rare, where students just leave one of these neighborhood schools to attend another one. And the reasons why that occurs, you spoke about it a little bit in the open. There's perceptions of safety. There's perceptions of perhaps there's an academic program at this neighborhood high school that is attractive to what my child feels their career goals are. Perhaps there's a teacher there. Perhaps we were recruited. You know, you see high schools, you know, going into neighborhoods and trying to establish relationships with feeder elementary schools in this kind of Hunger Games kind of environment for students. And so, you know, perhaps there was a relationship established there that sent me in that direction. So many different concepts here, but I think ultimately it's a pursuit. It's based in a pursuit of the perception of quality. You know, however that's, you know, however that manifests itself.
I mean, I was reminded reading this of the Chicagoland series on CNN, which was about Fenger, and the principal, Liz Dozier, and there's like entire segments of the show devoted to her running around knocking on doors and trying to recruit people to come to Fenger. She's long since gone from there, and what are the, I had the Fenger numbers here somewhere. There, 251 kids in a high school for 1,560. That's what's happened to Fenger since that show. Those numbers have obviously gone way down. So, I mean, you know, Manly High School, 114 for 1,536. And of course, I think the biggest gap, I believe, is Orr, right? 277 kids banging around inside 2112 capacity. As I mentioned, I worked for the city for a long time, and I did videos for the mayor's office and that kind of thing, and was in a lot of these buildings. We did a number of videos in Fenger for the After School Matters program that they had there, and these were not happy places. You didn't get a vibe when you walked in there that this is a place where kids are just, they can't wait to get to school. They're just kind of dreary, old, kind of, I don't know, they're downers. These places are just downers, and I can understand how parents would say, well, if we got something better, let's go to it.
And that creates a very interesting cycle, and almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. You see, well, I guess I should start by saying this. Jennifer Smith Richards is an exceptional reporter and an even better person. If she were here today, I think she would say something along the lines of, it's one thing to look at the size of the populations that are within these buildings and exclaim, oh my goodness, look how small these buildings are. But it's another thing entirely to look at the sheer population drop, at the speed and the depth of which this population decline has occurred within these buildings over the course of the past 10 years. And from there, remember, we work in a school system that now pays schools based on the amount of students that they enroll, right? That's part of this here. And as parents exercise their choice and leave their neighborhood buildings for somewhere else, no matter where it is, no matter for what reasons, and half of all CPS students within the system are doing this, you know, 50 are exercising choice, are leaving their neighborhood buildings. And that percentage jumps even higher when you talk about high schools. But as these families leave, what happens to the schools that are left behind? And what happens to the resources for these buildings that are left behind? And it reaches a point where, again, you have to really start having an honest conversation with yourself as to whether or not too small to succeed is one of the kind of catchphrases that kept ricocheting around my head. Because here's what happens. I mean, the experience, parents leave, resources dwindle as a result, and the educational experience that's delivered to these children is not at all in line with what you would consider to be the high school experience that you could find in the suburbs or even in a zip code in a different part of Chicago.
Yeah.
You only have 2 options for foreign language classes, Spanish 1 and Spanish 2 in some cases. You can't take physics. You don't have the level of after-school programs or extracurricular activities or electives.
Sports.
Football, it's these sorts of things that we tend to identify with the very fabric of high school life does not exist in these buildings to the extent that it exists in others. And look at the populations of these buildings. Look at who's suffering.
Yeah.
We have to ask ourselves whether this is an acceptable outcome. And part of, I guess, my objective here is, at the very least, sparking a broader civic discussion, an honest one, and an open one in the city about, is this an acceptable outcome? And why has this happened? What have we done to contribute to this problem, if anything?
Well, I want to quote you back to yourself, just because I thought a couple of sentences here I thought were really important to this conversation. It might be easy to assume, Juan Perez Jr. says, that these high schools are shrinking because the surrounding neighborhoods are hollowing out. That's not true. There were roughly 2,700 high school students living in Gage Park High School's attendance boundary on the southwest side last year. Only 330 attend school. CPS says the school can comfortably educate 1,100. There's 330 there now. Most of the other eligible students enrolled in 153 other CPS high schools. Now,
I still...
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
I didn't really actually know that there were 153 other high schools in Chicago. If before I read your story you had asked me how many high schools there were, I would have said, I think there's close to 100. But it's not true.
And then we start thinking about, like, well, what about the individual programs that are in? There are multiple programs inside individual buildings sometimes. You have your IB programs, you have your CTE programs, you have your selective or magnet programs. Charter schools are also part of the ecosystem here. What we've done in the city is we have created a classic supply and demand quandary here, wherein we have experienced, I mean, just look at the trend lines for overall population within CPS over the course of the past 10 years, and a drop of 40,000 students. And then think about how during the same period you've constructed or opened or just made available new options for, new programs and new options for families to choose from. I mean, do the math, right? What results there? And I think this gets a little bit to what I was suggesting earlier about Janice Jackson and how Dr. Jackson may pursue policy for the district here in the future, because she stated pretty clearly that if the district continues to see areas in which they feel a quality choice can be offered to parents, if there's an opportunity for that, they are going to pursue that opportunity, and they are going to open new programs if they deem that to be necessary. So you see how this road is going to, we're going to continue following that road. That looks to be what the answer is going to be from the district. But again, the big question is, what do you do? There are consequences to this. There are very clear consequences to this, and there are consequences that tend to affect black and brown children more than they do other children within the city of Chicago.
Well, that always comes up to be the key question that we have to evaluate here. We've talked about this before, you and I, but one of the earthquakes that has happened in the last 10 years at CPS, as far as I'm concerned, was the initiation of this student-based budgeting policy, where every school gets a certain amount of money depending on the number of kids that they enroll. It was not like that until a few years ago. Schools were budgeted. They made their case for their budget, and they got what they could get. There are probably good and bad arguments for both, but it clearly is the reason that this situation exists today. The reason that Finger has only a couple of hundred kids in it is because the enrollment began dropping, and so therefore the amount of money that they had to work with began dropping, and they had to lay off counselors, they had to lay off physics teachers, whatever it is. As you say, athletics programs are dropped. The school becomes less attractive, the parents don't want to go there, and you get into a death cycle.
Right.
And maybe some of these schools needed to be put into a death cycle, but it's hard to argue that some of the most classic neighborhood high schools in Chicago's history deserve this kind of treatment. It's hard to figure it out.
I do not envy the people who are paid a lot more than I to come to these sorts of decisions. Right. But at the same time, this is again why I would argue that there needs to be a broader discussion as far as what the district needs to answer. Arguably, what is the plan? Is there a plan? Yeah. If there isn't a plan, we should probably be making a plan, and we should probably be determining what the potential outcomes of those plans might be. Yeah. This is not going away. It's not going to slow down. And again, look at what's happening in Englewood. The city has clearly realized that 3 of the schools on our list of 17, as well as a 4th school, Team Englewood, are going to be closing down here if this goes through at the end of this school year. Mm-hmm. And
Harper and Hope and Robeson.
Right. And the students who are displaced from that action will be sent to other surrounding school buildings, and then a new, potentially $85 million, probably more expensive structure will open in the fall of 2019, but just to freshmen.
I just realized that they're going to knock Robeson down. Huh?
Yeah, that's the plan anyway. Yeah. They'll demolish it and probably build the new structure just basically on the site or in the immediate vicinity. If I'm not mistaken,
that's a relatively new school, Robeson, isn't it? I think that's like in the last 30 years or something. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But anyway, so it's going to get knocked down, and they're going to build an $85 million school. And what is the hope there? That a brand new, bigger, nicer school will start attracting more students to come there?
Potentially. I mean, you see what's happening on 63rd Street there. The tentative steps towards a revival that Englewood is experiencing right now, but there is a palpable sense, at least in some circles, there's a fear of displacement that's associated with that.
I've definitely heard that whole conversation going on, that, why did they put in a Whole Foods on 63rd Street? Because they're planning for all the white people who are going to be living there in 30 years or 25 years. And so maybe they're going to build this brand new school so it'll be the South Side, North Side Prep or something.
That's the question. Who will this building serve?
Yeah.
I don't know yet. But in the immediate term, we have to assess the conditions of the buildings that are going to be replaced right now. That did not happen overnight. That population decline did not happen overnight, and the conditions that have been persisted in those buildings did not pop up just here in recent memory.
And these buildings are behemoths. I mean, they are massive, massive buildings. They take up 2 blocks in some cases, and we've had enough problems with the 30 schools or 50 schools that were closed, and many of them never got repurposed, and they're still just sitting there. Imagine, Bowen High School or something just being empty and
gorgeous
vacant.
Building.
Yeah, so there's a lot to that. So at this point, is it reasonable to ask the question? Our mayor and the mayor before him, they were gung-ho on choice. If they had a plan, Juan, it was choice. Sure. We're going to open lots of schools. We're going to make many of them charters. Then we found out that the charters, on the whole, didn't really solve the problem either. But we just ended up with a lot more schools. And maybe we just have too many of these new schools. Maybe some of those smaller, newer schools are going to get crushed in all of this too.
Potentially, but I don't know. I don't know that Again, I see the district, if it spots opportunities for new options, it's going to pursue those options, and it's going to open them if it can justify it. Yeah. And so, I don't know how the newer buildings are going to fare. I do know the district is, as you know, is beginning to crack down a little bit on some charter schools that aren't quite performing up to the standards that the district has set. But on the whole, though, there are still a lot of charters operating in the city, and there's, again, a lot of selective enrollment, magnet programs, IB programs, a bountiful array of options, a dizzying array of options, frankly, for families to choose from. And you'll see now that the district has begun this high school application process in which...
Oh, we haven't even talked about that, right.
Could be
another major piece of this.
Right, and that's the outcome of that is going to be fascinating to me, because then you'll have data that the district can point to say, well, look how parents and families and students are rank ordering their choices for the high schools they want to attend.
It's a centralized application that everyone can apply to I guess any school, or they, or within,
if they have the quality, it's at least a
quality,
centralized repository
right.
to handle the dizzying array of
Right.
applications that you
Right.
had for selectives or whatever else. If you still want to attend your neighborhood school, you will still be able to attend your neighborhood school, but I'm curious to see how those buildings will fare in all of this.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't know yet. I mean, the final deadline is approaching here this month. And it may be a while before we see the data or see the mechanics, the behind-the-scenes mechanics that
Yeah.
work that data to come up with the outcomes that it comes up with.
I almost never say this on this show, but in some dark corner, I'm seeing a little bit of optimism here, because at least, how do I put this? At least there are positive options. Right? I mean, it's not like everything is just dying. The system is dying. The system is radically restructuring itself and rebuilding itself. And there are potentials that some new stars could be born, and that we could end up with a much stronger and better system in the end. But we're in this horrible, painful period right now where we're just seeing more change than we've ever seen before. And I don't know, change is hard,
Right.
Right. Well, okay. So, did we? We haven't even really begun to cover it as much as I'd like to, but we're pretty much out of time. So I guess this is where we have to drop it and just ask you to keep us informed and come back again when there's more. It is a fascinating period that we're in with the Chicago Public Schools, and now under new leadership. So we will see what we see, huh?
It's going to be a long game.
It is going to be a long game. It really is. Juan Perez Jr. is the co-author of this wonderful series, Can These High Schools Survive? There's a bigger title.
Just Google Shrinking Schools,
Shrinking
Chicago
Schools.
Tribune.
That's
Yeah.
it, Shrinking Schools. And you can do exactly that, and you should. Google it and read it. You will be glad that you did, I promise. So thanks for being here, Juan.
Thank you for having me.
You're watching Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis. Don't forget, you can watch this and all of these other shows by going right here to this address, and we hope you will do that because there's a lot of interesting stuff out there. See you next time. Bye-bye.